Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to start our final panel session to go into the networking reception afterwards. So we have 3 new panelists today. This is the country panel. So essentially what we've done is we've picked panelists who are experts in specific regions. On the far right, we have Duarte Pedreira from Crown Agents Bank. In the middle, we have Annett from the Norwegian British Chamber of Commerce. And on my side, we have Masamichi from JETRO, representing Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and the Asia Pacific. So the 3 questions are going to be different. Same rules applies to this one. Statement, hands up, agree to disagree, and then go to war, essentially. Okay? So without further ado, let's begin with the first statement. My region presents the biggest internal market growth opportunity globally. So do you agree or disagree with this statement? My region presents the best internal market growth opportunity globally.
So what do we do?
So hands up if you agree. Yeah? Yeah? Agree? And Annett, what do you think?
You can just take a neutral stance on it.
You don't agree? No, okay. So we have Sub-Saharan Africa agree, Europe disagree, and Asia Pacific agree. Okay, so whoever would like to start first, take it away.
All right, why don't I have a stab? Look, for those of you who are not familiar with this, whilst the rest of the world has gone into economic nationalism, Africa has decided to go completely in the opposite direction. So they created the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has been pretty much ratified by every single country in Africa. Therefore, creating the largest free market, if I can call it that, that was ever created since the inception of the the WTO. It's the most exciting free trade opportunity globally at the moment, and I can give you some further color on this. So the idea is to grow intra-Africa trade from about 5% of total Africa trade into about 20-30%. Those of you who have been in Africa, I don't know how many in the audience have had the absolute pleasure of standing in the border between, for example, Gisenyi and Goma in Rwanda and DRC. But you can see that there is a lot of trade going on there, most of which was done informally. So the borders were extremely porous. Nowadays, in Gisenyi at least, there is a state-of-the-art border post which is fully geared to cater for the AFCFTA, or the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So are we there yet? Not quite, but these things do take time. But there's a huge infrastructure being created around foreign exchange, payments, and customs harmonization. And we mustn't forget that Africa at the moment is one of the youngest, most vibrant, most demanding markets that we have out there. And this has the appeal and the possibility of actually changing mentalities altogether. If I ask you, how do you think about Africa? If you tell me in one sentence without thinking, I think 9 out of 10 of you will tell me, oh yeah, they export commodities, unprocessed, right? So there's no value add left in Africa. The moment that Africa aligns itself to create this free trade area, the whole continent becomes a very, very attractive block for anyone who wants to export, quite frankly. So there is this shift in mentality where it becomes a privilege not to import unprocessed raw stuff from Africa, but it becomes a privilege to be able to export into Africa. So for example, for a multinational to establish themselves in Kigali and as I've seen. Do you know that they actually assemble computers in Rwanda? You do? Do you know that they produce mobile phones in Rwanda for Africa, for African markets? And they produce cars and so on and so forth. I'm a huge fan of Rwanda. I run an NGO there. But in essence, when you start having mobile phones built in Africa for Africans, you know that at least the direction of travel is definitely the right one. So I'll leave it there, shall I? I could go on.
Very concise, fantastic. Masamichi, would you like to take the...
Yes.
Okay. That's all.
Okay, so I will make some... okay.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. So I'd like to make some comments on Asia Pacific region, and actually, countries in the Asia Pacific region have achieved growth by promoting economic integration through trade liberalization. Particularly since the 1990s, those countries have been negotiating and concluding various trade agreements, including, CPTPP or RCEP or any other bilateral trade agreements. And now there is a U.S.-China confrontation in Asia Pacific, and there's a discussion of decoupling, primarily driven by U.S. So now many industries operating in Asia Pacific region have become aware of some geopolitical risks operating in China. That's the biggest change in recent years. But actually, many companies may still be heavily dependent on Chinese market. When looking at their actual business activities, we can recall the situation of European business operating in China. For example, some of European automotive industry is heavily dependent on Chinese market. So even U.S. argue about the decoupling from China, still they have to maintain their operations in China. So in that sense, still when looking at various regions as a market globally, Asia Pacific region is one of the biggest opportunity for business side even today. So this is my argument about that.
Fantastic. Annett, rather. Thank you. That's perfect.
Yes, so Europe, I don't think on a global level is going to be the market with the best growth over the next few years. Coming from, in Europe, the energy crisis, we've had inflation, interest rates coming up, and all these things have obviously affected growth. And this year, most people are not really expecting any growth overall in Europe. Might be some over the next year. There's, of course, still a lot of positive things happening in Europe on a sector basis specifically. However, we're sort of looking on it overall, and the question there, is it sort of the best place in terms of growth globally? I don't think so. I think there is definitely higher growth in other markets.
Okay, very honest of you. Very well. So, Duarte, we've obviously, can you just turn that piece off? Thank you. Duarte, when we've known each other for a long time, and when you speak to businesses who have no connection to the continent, you mentioned the trade finance gap is huge. This is why your bank is very well situated, because you're in the heart of it. When you try to speak to your colleagues who favor other regions, what kinds of things do you show to them to engage them more so when it comes time to business opportunities there? Or is there perception of it being too risky, anti-money laundering risks and all the rest of it. Is there anything that you say to them to spark their interest in that region?
Working or no? I need a proper one. Thank you. Whoa, thank you very much. Okay, don't get me started. So compliance, really? Yeah, it's very easy, right? Everybody can say, oh yeah, Sierra Leone, Liberia, too risky. Is it really? Because the whole de-risking, sorry, I don't want to use financial jargon, but the whole phenomena of foreign banks not wanting to go into some African markets on the basis of perceived risk is just inaccurate. Why is that? Because it's all about cost benefit, isn't it? Because if you think about it, for a large global US headquartered bank, whichever it might be, and it's kind of applicable across the board, the decisions that they have to make are around, do I really want to go into Liberia and provide banking services to one of the local banks, and effectively I'll make my money around external business that they will do on behalf of their clients, and maybe I make what, $20,000, $30,000, but still I have to invest in onboarding them, and it's just such a pain. That's one way of looking at it. So basically, when the IMF asks these guys, why did you leave half of the world hanging without access to the external financial markets or financial network? They say, ooh, you know, you guys are imposing all these very, very heavy compliance fines on us, so you left us with no other option. Different angle, which of course I would say this, but it's the way we at CAB do business, is we actually care. So we go there and we ask the guys, look, first and foremost, we've got some experts in anti-money laundering, anti-financial crime and whatever. For us to start a conversation and allow our guys to come in and do an assessment of what you do. And then we're going to tell you what gaps there are, and we're going to tell you, look, this is where you need to invest in. What do you think the Liberian bank is going to say after they receive the report and the gaps and so on? Are they going to say, oh, I'm not going to do this, and continue isolated from the rest of the world? Of course not. They're going to say, okay, how much does it cost? And they go and source out whatever systems they need, and they upgrade their compliance and whatever. And there was a bank, not in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. We identified that their account opening standards were sub in terms of quality. So they had to pretty much redo every single onboarding file for every single retail client of theirs, and they had like 1 million retail clients. It was insane. So they hired literally an army of people to go through those files, and they did it in 3 months. Did it cost money? Yes, it did, but at least they had the chance. They were asked the question, do you want to do it? Yes, we do. How much does it cost? It costs this. Okay, we'll invest. Did they get onboarded in the end? Of course they did. The other thing is, if I think I'm not going to generate enough money to commercially justify the relationship, I ask them the following questions, very simple. Look, open book, this is how much I think I'm going to need to bring you on board, because if I just live out of your flows and transaction income and whatever, it's not going to make the cut. The minimum I need is X. Can you pay that? Then they're confronted with the option of either being outside the banking system altogether or inside. Guess what their answer is, right? So ultimately, you talk to me about trade finance gap and compliance drivers and whatever. I'm trying to mince my words here, as you can see, I feel very strongly about it, but it's inaccurate. I would say rubbish, but I'm trying to be polite. So, yeah, look, the gap in itself is it's the way we perceive it, right? And what we're going to do about it. But the gap, the origins of the gap are much, much deeper than that. But you're just touching on compliance, so I thought I'll give you that perspective.
Fantastic. We'll move on to our second statement now. And that one is, I am worried about the rising geopolitical risk in the world and what this means for my region. So once more, I am worried about the rising geopolitical risk in the world and what this means for my region. Hands up if you disagree.
Can I sit in the middle?
No. So either agree. So hands up if you agree. Okay, so Asia Pacific agrees. And does Europe agree? This one's a deep one, I think. They're thinking about it. They're thinking about it.
I'm measuring the pros and cons. It's a bit of a horrible one when you're measuring the pros and cons.
Before you go into it, Duarte, do you agree or disagree? And then we'll jump into it.
Okay,
Hands up if you agree. Disagree. Okay. So Sub-Saharan Africa disagrees, Asia Pacific agrees, and Europe in the middle. Which way is she going to go? I'm worried about the rising geopolitical risk in the world and what this means for my region.
Think about cost of energy.
Well, say yes.
Yes, you agree. So 2 agree and 1 disagree. Take the floor, whoever wants to go first. Masamichi, would you like to start first?
Okay.
So Asia Pacific agrees with this statement.
Okay, so I would go first. I think you have to think 2 aspects of the geopolitical issues in the Asia-Pacific region. One is general supply chain issues, and another is energy issues, I think. Okay. For supply chain issues, many companies operating in Asia-Pacific region have a big part of the supply chain developed within China. Actually, many Japanese manufacturers are operating in China, and they are manufacturing a certain amount of parts there and exporting to the other factories and fabs all over the world. So now there's a certain extent of geopolitical risk in Taiwan Strait. Mm-hmm. So many companies are now thinking, and now they are aware of the existence of geopolitical risk there. So they are now facing with the question how they can pursue in their supply chain to establish efficient and cost competitive supply chain, and also how to ensure the resilience of the supply chain. So this is a very big question and very big argument to be overcome in coming years. So this is the first point on geopolitical risk within the region. Mm-hmm. And the second one is about the energy. Actually, most of Asia-Pacific countries are dependent on fossil fuels. For example, Japan is dependent on LNG import from other countries because we don't have a very good environment for renewable energies, and we are still struggling with restarting our existing nuclear reactors. So at the moment we have to use oil and gas. So and this kind of situation can be seen in other Asia-Pacific countries, including South Korea or ASEAN countries. And now, at the moment, LNG prices are not so expensive, but still there's a big uncertainty in the outlook of the natural gas price. And especially last year, European countries purchased LNGs from the spot market, and that pushed up the price for the Asia-Pacific countries when in procuring LNGs from spot market. So it affected a lot of the energy price in Asia-Pacific region. So I think this ongoing geopolitical tension, geopolitical risk, could be still the big. It will have a big impact on energy and economic situation in the Asia-Pacific region. That is the reason I think I'm still worried about this geopolitical tension in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you, Masamichi. Annett, you were hesitant to give an answer straight away. What are your members at the Chamber of Commerce thinking about, do you think, during this time? Yeah, take them both.
Is it
Yeah, both of them. Yeah, both of them. That's fine. Yeah. Just what? Yeah, that's fine. Both. Yeah. What are your members at the Chamber of Commerce thinking about and saying to you about the rising level of risk, especially within Europe?
Well, what we're talking a lot about in the Chamber of Commerce, representing Norway, as I am, is of course energy. Norway's export is 80% energy. So most of the members of the chamber would be in the energy sector, directly or indirectly. So we talk a lot about that. And in terms of what we've seen in Europe, end of last year, this year, with the massive energy prices we had at the end of last year, and there was a lot of talk about it being a shortage of energy, which there actually never really was. There was always enough. According to what we're talking about in the chamber, but there was a price issue, and Europe didn't want to use the reserves they had. There was energy in storage that they wanted to kind of save in case it was going to be worse. So now it looks like the energy situation has been solved temporarily. It depends a lot on the winter, if it's going to be cold or not. But I'm actually quite positive when it comes to that. And longer term, there is so much going on in the renewables market. We see the Norwegian energy companies investing more and more in renewables. Of course, still the main production is oil and gas, but going forward, there will be a lot of investments in renewables. Windmills, solar, hydrogen, all these things will be important. So that's why it is difficult to say whether I'm kind of optimistic. I think we will get there. There might be some temporary times where prices will be high, maybe, but I think long term it will be fine.
Fantastic. Have you got anything else to add, Duarte?
Yes. So why was I sitting on the fence to start with? Because on the one hand, if you're talking about geopolitical events nowadays, what do you think? What's on everybody's minds? So war in Ukraine. The big downside of that, and I say that without any smile on my face, obviously, is that it causes a huge food crisis in Africa. Because the African diet is wheat-based, and good luck if you can import wheat these days. It's subject to very, very intense scrutiny from any bank's compliance department. Just to make sure that it doesn't touch Russia. And I've seen, I've got many central bank clients and commercial bank clients across Africa, and it's quite a desperate thing, I would say, to a certain extent. Now, to put a smile back on my face, and hopefully yours, why do I think is actually generating more opportunity? Because Africa has always been an amazing battleground for everybody. Everybody wants a piece of it. So when the US wants to increase its influence, it goes there. China does the same. China does it in an amazing way, whether you like it or not, right? So they go and they said, look, I used to live in Angola between 2010 and 2012, I think it was. And it was so big, the Chinese influence there, that when I came back to London after a while, I started here at SOAS learning Mandarin, Putonghua. Because even the traffic signs in Angola were in Mandarin. And the way they were doing this was to, get some oil shipped out to China, and in return they will send Chinese construction companies, rail companies, etc., 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 with their own staff, with their own trucks, with their own, materials, to rebuild Angola or any African country, right? They build airports, they build railway lines, they build entire cities. I was once in a city within Luanda. It was like a movie set. It was insane. So what am I trying to say? Now, before that was actually a little bit depressing, because Africa was kind of with the begging hat out, and they were saying, can you give me a bit of money? I'm really struggling, my debt and this and that and the other. Now it's a lot more focused. And linking with my previous comments on the AFCFTA, Africa kind of holds the balance of power. I don't think Russia is in a position, as they were in the past, to come into the discussion. Turkey is all over Africa now. So Turkey are becoming a huge player in Africa. What are they doing? Turkish companies are outstanding. If you don't know this, take my word for it. Outstanding in terms of construction, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But they all do it in a way that allows them to gain more influence, more geopolitical influence, right? Which is great. But now the difference is there is a sort of a positive, I'm not a huge believer in nationalism, but there is a huge positive sense of Africanism, right? And the creation of the AFCFTA is a good example of that. African growth for Africans, African development for Africans, and kind of I consider myself half African, we dictate the pace, we dictate the rules. So it's a bit different from what it was before. So geopolitical instability, great, because Africa will be needed and more money will come to the continent, and I think that's quite important.
Fantastic. The last and final statement is the following. I am confident that my region is the most prepared to take a leadership role in tech innovation in 2023 and beyond. So one more time, I am confident that my region is the most prepared to take a leadership role in tech innovation in 2023 and beyond. So we have an obvious hand up from Duarte. How about the other two? What do we think? Is your region the best prepared to take a leadership role in tech innovation in 2023 and beyond?
I would disagree.
Disagree? So a disagree from Europe, disagree from Asia Pacific, and an agree from Sub-Saharan Africa. Shall we start with Europe first this time? Yeah.
Well, again, I think I'm coming from a sort of a relative perspective here, just seeing that other areas of the world just seem to have better momentum in terms of leadership. Again, I think in terms of technology, is that, in tech innovation. But again, I think it depends on the sector, that in terms of certain sectors, I'm sure that Europe will kind of be on the forefront on those sectors that are strong in Europe. I think there will be some kind of leadership, but
You're not confident that side? Okay. Masamichi, what do you think?
Yes.
No, that one. That's fine, yeah.
Okay. I think in terms of tech innovation, Asia Pacific region is somehow divided. When looking at for example, when looking at innovation in semiconductors, From Japanese perspective, we would conduct R&Ds in advanced semiconductors with like-minded countries like US or maybe it will be UK or EU. But anyway, from this kind of advanced technologies development, Japan and some other Asian countries will act as one part of the global West. And there is China, which is now very keenly investing in semiconductor fields and other fields to catch up the technology of the US or in Europe. So there is such kind of tension in the region. So when thinking about that kind of situation, I wouldn't say Asia Pacific region will lead the ongoing technology innovation. So rather than leading that, Asia Pacific region may be the some battlefield of this kind of competition in innovation. That is my view at this point.
Well, if you compare that to Japan, and specifically, since you represent Japan, is there much difference between what's happening in Japan and the rest of the Asia Pacific? Do you think Japan is doing more things than the rest?
Well, Japan is doing cooperating with the US and the other countries, but maybe South Korea or Australia or some other countries in ASEAN will be the same direction. But when looking at the the vote of the United Nations with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's many Asian countries which has not shown their flag clearly. So I'm not sure the region as a whole will be going in which side. So that's my perception.
Okay, Duarte, what do you think?
First, I just want to make a comment. Can you imagine if you're kind of someone living in the 80s and all of a sudden you're teleported into this conversation where, we're arguing to a certain extent that there's more tech opportunities in Africa than there is in Japan. It would be insane. Okay, Africa. Think about this as a starting point. So Africa has kind of two speeds of development to a certain extent. One that went into a point when Africa could not liberate itself from legacy infrastructure. So if all of a sudden every piece of new technology that was being put out had to depend on fixed line technology, which was what we had up until the advent of mobile, then Africa would still be kind of at the back of the group of the race. The good thing about it is that we moved from fixed line technology into mobile. And the moment that happened, all of a sudden, Africa saw itself leading the pack rather than staying at the back of the pack. And because they leapfrogged fixed line altogether, right? So they didn't have to deal with the constraints and so on. Think about the US and the UK as examples. The US and the UK still lived in kind of analog telephony up until recently. I think COVID was that moment where everybody chucked their landlines in the bin. Although the numbers still exist, no one picks them up. So yeah, Africa's leapfrogged into data, and I would dare say that tech has become part of the African DNA for the new generations as much as farming had been for the older generations. And they really embodied that. Just a couple of examples. So fintechs, of course, being a banker, I'll have to talk about financial technology. Where do you think it's easier to make a payment, in Kenya or in the UK? Kenya. Very good. You go and you pay your taxi with mobile money. I told you I run an NGO in Rwanda. My community, so we invest in schools and early childhood education, and we run a community around the biggest school we have. And that is located close to the border with Burundi. Nearest bank branch is about 10 miles away. So sending money and cash in would never work. So every single person in that community has got a mobile phone. So when I send monies in, I send mobile money. It's as simple as that. And they transact in mobile money. I could give you another 10 examples involving even kind of offline prepaid card solution where beneficiaries of those cards are onboarded into the card schemes through their fingerprints and vital thingies and biometrics, they call it. It's super interesting. It's way, way ahead of anything that we do here in the UK. The other thing is the whole of these newer generations in Africa have become educated, data-driven, super demanding, super demanding, and they don't take no for an answer, which is great. This is the internet generation. I've got a colleague of mine, Nigel Atamensa. He works for the bank, but he's Ghanaian, and he runs a very interesting tech-based company, which is called Newcoma. And what they do is they use Newcoma as a platform to promote up-and-coming artists from Africa. And without this technology, these artists would just be confined to being unknown. Kind of, if they come out for a stint or something like that, they'll be seen at some point. But this really amplifies their works, and now they're even coming to London to showcase and so on, all because of technology and the way they use it.
But before we jump into questions, there's a difference between technology that scales across the globe and technology that fits a specific need in the region. So we can see that in Africa specifically, due to the lack of legacy infrastructure that we see in other places, they need to develop on top of what they have, right? But they don't have the capacity, or correct me if I'm wrong, to scale any technologies beyond the continent to other places, whereas you have innovations. Well, again,
you want to start the debate? Let's go.
I was going to say, that's the whole point, where you see perhaps innovation in other parts of the world that can be scaled across, whether it's fintech or medtech or whatever it is. The innovation happens in one part of the world, and then that can go across the world. And network effects, if it's something to do with communication, grows, or if it's a specific technology due to funding or whatever, it grows faster. Do you think that would be the case in Africa, that there's more innovation that helps the specific region as opposed to the scaling?
So Africa, scaling happens. Tell me, how much of Google Wallet or Apple Wallet, Apple Pay, is used in Africa?
You're going to tell me not as much as the domestic version. Exactly. Yeah, but how much of the domestic version is going to other places?
The market is already so developed that they, forgive me Apple, forgive me Google, love you to bits, but they don't need them, right? The other point is, it's not a coercive factor, because if anything, Africa is a net exporter of tech, believe it or not, right? Because they've tested it.
Exporting to who, though, specifically?
Europe, for example.
Or other African countries, or across continents?
That's taken as read, right? So, yes, they export to other African countries. Yes, there are multi-country payment solutions. There is even PAPS, which is the intra-Africa payment system, which is fully automated. Imagine having an automated settlement system which doesn't really require dollars, and just does you make a payment to a friend of yours from Zambia to Malawi. It doesn't go into US dollars. The guy receives the money in 10 seconds, and you pay in Malawi kwacha, he receives in Zambia kwacha, right? Try and do that in Europe without moving mountains.
You can say that again. You can say that again.
Good luck.
Well, on that end, we'd like to thank the panelists today. Give them a big round of applause. Big round of applause. And the stage is open for the next 10 minutes or so for Q&A to probe even further into the statements that the panel had.
Be kind to us.
Be extra not kind to them because they can take it. They can take it. Exactly. So anyone want to start with questions regarding the statements we had? Marcus, is that you? Yeah, continue. Fantastic.
Duarte, I'm particularly interested in the risks that you see because countries like Nigeria have phenomenal tech industry. My suspicion is that they're going to be very attractive as acquisitions. And how disruptive is that likely to be given the destructive nature of VC and private equity, not that I'm in any way biased?
You're going to throw me under the bus. I'm owned by private equity. All right. Now, listen, okay. We're owned by Helios Partners, which are amazing. I would say that anyways, but they are truly amazing. And they own a number of techs across the continent, you know, well, they're well known. I do think that the danger is that the big guys, and again, probably going to get sued by Apple and Google, but it's the big guys going there and trying to impose their models. That's been tried so many times. It used to be like governments trying to impose developed models. They don't work in Africa. Wake up, right? So to try and do the same with the big techs, trying to go and impose their models into models that already work and trying to change the landscape, that worries me a bit because they've got more money, right? But at the same time, I'm a huge believer that at the backers of African tech also start having some deep pockets and they can kind of fight back.
Fantastic question, Marcus. Anyone else? Yes?
How do you see the challenge of inflation across the Africa region and the management of that and its positioning around, you know, the strength of that economic development?
Listen, I'm no economist myself, right? But
to give background, I work across Africa region and invest within that region and also manage and support businesses across that in the tech space, in the ag space, in the wash space. And they are absolutely struggling at the moment.
Yeah, definitely.
And they're looking across their 1 year, 5 year, 10-year horizon and going, this is scary times.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Again, in the context of my activities in Rwanda, I also have a goddaughter there and school fees are becoming quite prohibitive. I'm no economist, but if you go into the root causes, can we really say, I'm not just talking about Africa, I'm talking about globally, can we really say we haven't seen this coming?
The ability to manage it. So my worry,
yeah.
like my position, well not position, my question, the question is, how do you perceive that you said that Africa is a region that will be invested?
Yeah, I personally think that Africa, so it's affecting everywhere, but Africa can come out of it quicker than the developed markets. I know it's controversial, but think about this. In Africa, although public debt is high, private debt is not as high. In the UK, let's talk about doomsday now. In the UK, all you need is this much delayed housing crash for everything to go pear-shaped, properly pear-shaped. You're talking about, you know, of course interest rates are on the rise, people start not being able to afford their mortgages, foreclosures, bank collateral goes, you know, sinks. then you'd start talking about other bailouts and so on as a consequence. Do we really still have money for bailouts? Now, if you're talking about an African country, and we talked about this in the context of bilateral debt, Chinese still have deep pockets. All they have to do, so the Chinese and the Japanese have been financing the whole of the world. I normally say big brother, small brother, or father and son, right? Asia has been father to the rest of the world for a long, long time. We're just a misbehaved young brat that just goes out and spends on credit cards, right? So if the UK goes down that route, I don't think, especially given that geopolitical framework, I don't think Asia would be as open to continue that subsidiarization of our misguided spending as they would into a Kenya or into a Malawi or Djibouti, for example, where they can have a much, much more focused approach for getting benefit out of the support of the balance of payments that they're doing out there. But again, I'm no economist, but that's my view.
Follow-up question.
Can you put your microphone?
Oh yeah, sorry, the follow-up question is, so with the dawn of, say, artificial intelligence being at people's hands and business hands, do you see that as a challenge to the African continent in terms of the uptake versus, say, more traditionally developed countries where they'll suddenly use it very quickly to lower costs, therefore we see a faster inflationary drop within those more, say, developed worlds where they can get access to it, whereas in parts of Africa where they might not be able to access it as quickly. So you're going to see a sudden shift, again, a power shift between the different kinds of regions.
Again, very interesting question. I would say that if you're talking to the kind of the older generations in Africa, definitely, I think your kind of positioning makes total sense. But if you're talking about the large growing young population in Africa, which is more open to any any tech development, especially AI, I think you're pushing at an open door, aren't you? Undoubtedly, yes. AI comes naturally for the so-called developed world, although I hate that expression. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the openness of African younger generations to keep up with this.
I think for me, it's, I think the innovation within, we're working a lot with Ghana.
Oh, Ghana is amazing.
Yeah, they absolutely love it. But you can see the people we work with, or the organisations, they haven't heard about it in the same manner. Whereas suddenly we're seeing the entire marketing departments of kind of companies across Europe going, maybe we don't need them. Strip out 20% of our cost base. And then if that is going to be very quickly happening, inflationary pressures drop.
Don't drop, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, right next to you. Yeah. Can you please introduce yourself as well, I forgot to say, and your question.
Hi, I'm Alex. Another lawyer in the room, apologies. Slightly confused on Brexit, we can have that over drink. I actually have a question for Annett. I know that you've been put there as Mrs. Europe, but I'm conscious that you are Mrs. Norway in some respects. I think it would be quite interesting to hear, because you've got one foot in, one foot out of Europe in Norway, if there's any sort of unique positioning that you feel Norway has or that Scandinavia has by comparison to Europe as a whole continent.
In terms of what?
Sorry, in terms of the discussion that we were having here about technological solutions and sort of wider comparisons to the other continents that have been in the discussion.
In terms of technology?
Yeah. It's not traditionally been a huge focus. It's quite interesting to know if there's anything going on.
In Scandinavia? Well, in Norway, I would say it's obviously working on technology within the energy sector, that type of thing. I have to admit that in terms of Sweden and Denmark, it's not my area. I wouldn't really know. So I'm not even going to try to pretend I do. So, yeah, That's basically. I wouldn't either. I don't see Scandinavia being that different to the rest of Europe, really, when it comes to technology. But they are kind of more technologically advanced in many ways, especially Norway, which I know best. That's where I'm from. Compared to the UK, it's massively more. I mean, in the UK, do people still use checks here? I think people do. I mean, we couldn't do that in Norway like 20 years ago. You can pay, with a card in a taxi 10 years ago. It's just, and internet is working. So generally, I think Scandinavia is ahead technologically in terms of how society works.
To take on that point, when we're looking at Europe through the index lens as well, we see that Europe ranks as the most powerful region, let's say. So when anyone looks at this, they tend to think best opportunities are going to be there, right? But what isn't taken into consideration is the fact that without knowing more specifics in terms of what the question is, it could also represent that this region has reached its peak in terms of development. And although there's regions which are lower, more ranked lower, that means their upside is a lot higher. So it's not good to automatically assume that although it's the highest, it's the best. It could be that it's the most diluted, or it's the most worked upon, which is why, thank you, which is why they're so high. So there's opportunities in regions and in countries which are ranked lower because the upside, given the right stimulus, can make it go a lot higher into the future. So if you're a business looking to invest in any region, any country, don't let the fact that it's lower put you off, because there's sort of a power arbitrage that you can take advantage of depending on who you are. Marcus, go ahead.
Okay, so big question. Big question. Looking globally, there are 3 countries that I'm aware of that have total economic independence, so they are completely functional separately. The US, Mexico, and France. The rest of us are totally in each other's pockets. I'm really curious how you guys think the world is going to shift as we start to become more and more polarized, because we're seeing that across the globe. The extremes seem to be gaining ground, and the middle ground seems to have been lost. And I'm really interested to understand how that interdependence is going to play out over the next 20, 30 years. Because until we get energy independent and food independent, we're in each other's pockets. So I'm just curious about that.
Well, from an Africa point of view, I think you know my opinion, but kind of going outside of Africa a little bit, I think you're right. I think that the polarization is a path. I think it must be temporary, right? So when the whole globalization thing started, everybody hit this, not everybody, but a certain group of people hit to the street and protesting and creating havoc and so on, because it was such a bad thing. And now we all go and just savor in each other's cultures, right? Be it kind of food, but films and so on and so forth. So I think ultimately, I'm going to try not to get too deep here, but ultimately it's psychological. Why is that? And if you think about it, what led to the Second World War, for example? It was the Great Depression. Great Depression made people feel really bad about their job security, financial independence, and so on. So it's very easy to start blaming others for our lack of success to a certain extent. And I didn't hear your debate. Unfortunately, I had a couple of calls I had to attend, but I didn't hear the debate on Brexit, so I may be going to really dangerous waters now. But I think it's easy to say that Brexit was also caused by that. So after the 2008 financial crisis, the whole world started contracting and people started feeling threatened, right? So we need to blame someone somehow, right? So I think this polarization, and Mr. Trump as well, trying to feed on people's fears, and he's not alone, and you know, the resurgence of nationalism in Italy and in France. I'm hoping it's temporary, because if it's not temporary, it'll probably end in a really dark space. But hopefully people will understand that this interdependence is better than kind of the island perspective. And of course the French would survive, because they've got wine and cheese, why not?
Masamichi, would you like to comment on that as well?
Well, this is a very good question. I think actually the idea that deepening economic interdependence dependence through the liberalization or any other activities is beneficial from even from a security perspective. That kind of idea now became quite a naive idea, and we are now we now found that economic growth has increased the legitimacy even of the authoritarian states, and led to challenges to the international order by them. And revenue of economic growth and the technology were used by authoritarian states to build up and modernize their military forces or such kind of thing. So this I have not I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question, but anyway, the countries, it is not confined to Asia Pacific, but many countries have to strengthen their economic security in order to reduce the risk of over-dependency on authoritarian regime. That is one point. But at the same time, we have to strengthen cooperation by bringing the like-minded countries together under the flag of a classic free trade notion and not protectionism. So I think such kind of establishing resilience, dependency, and also pursuing free trade and liberalization. We have to take balances of these two notions. So this is, I think, a very difficult question.
Would you like to chime in, Annett? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking in terms of, for example, in Europe with the energy situation. I attended an energy security seminar on Monday at House of Lords, and it was stressed that in order to sort of have security going forward in that, it's very important that Europe work together. In terms of the grid, for example, this energy needs to be transported to the right places, so we need to work together. That is one example where that's very important. And also when it comes to, well, Brexit, now I'm talking for the Chamber of Commerce, has actually caused quite a few challenges for many of our members, which are mainly Norwegian companies based in the UK. And of course, for Norway, exporting energy is not a problem. But these energy companies have offices in Norway. They also have in London, in Aberdeen. And they used to be able to take people back and forth. This is now actually very, very difficult. And they cannot so longer do that. Just so they tend to not take so many people over to the UK. And hence, that business will be gone. So it's expensive, it's difficult, and it's affecting their businesses. And generally also trade outside that sector, it is complicated and expensive and takes longer. We see that. So we're trying to help them as much as we can, of course, but it has definitely affected.
May I ask, has that affected innovation in the industry?
Has
the difficulty moving people around affected your ability to innovate?
Yeah, I think, for example, R&D will now be done for some of the energy companies. One example, they will do their R&D in Norway and not here because they can't take the people over as easily as before. Otherwise, they would do a little bit here, a little bit. They take the people over and they keep working on it in the UK. Now that will just, the whole operation might happen in Norway instead, for example.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we're gonna. Would you like an answer from me as well, Marcus? No.
Well, if you want, yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Can you rephrase the question again for me, please?
It's all about the interdependence, because all the economies seem to be intertwined, and until we learn how to cooperate, we need to start trying to build bridges and look for what we have in common. So I'm curious, is there pressure there, and where is it coming from? How are we going to do that?
Yeah. I think when you say you have to look at what you have in common, what's more important for countries is the agendas that they want to enact, right? So having something in common doesn't mean anything unless there is a substantial benefit for that country to do business with another country. So as our data shows, over time, in general, countries grow their COPs, their centers of power, which means in the past, they may not have been that vocal when they were frustrated at terms that another country gave them, so they wouldn't say much. But as they grow across these things, they have a bigger voice, whether it's regional politics, economics, or global, depending on their size and scale. So they can either decide to hash things out at places like the WTO, or take matters elsewhere. And like what we've been seeing over time is that creating something alternative to the WTO, right? For countries which don't agree with the processes there. So institutions like this become even more important to bring people together to one table, as opposed to have a fractious table, depending on what the issues are. But my fear is, and I think COVID was a perfect example, is that when countries panic, it's all hands on deck for their own, And when people panic, they don't think about cooperation as much because they're in survival mode, and it doesn't work well. Over time, we're going to have more fractious politics, I fear, because these are just going to compound, and there's not going to be. I don't see any one force bringing people together that they have to focus on this. And if there is, once that crisis is averted, they go back to their corners.
There's one thing that none of us have talked about, which is the total lack of leadership. Leadership is at the moment at an all-time low. The management as the functional layer are the most undertrained, underdeveloped people out there. They've got 3% of the global training budget, and they're constantly under pressure.
I don't agree with that there's no leadership, because the leadership that you're talking about is perhaps vocal leadership on a global level. And the authority of that went to the Americans once upon a time to speak on behalf of the world. Now we have leadership, regional leadership for countries enacting what they believe is the best for their place. And if you as America, you as China don't agree with this, then tough luck, because we're going to continue anyway. So leadership with a homogeneous voice is no longer going to be there. Fractious leadership in your own pockets is going to be there. But the issue becomes, if my agendas go against yours, right? Now that I'm more powerful, we can scuff it out. And that could be higher tariffs, that could be anything. And businesses are going to be the victims of this. If they don't understand, if they do, then they can maneuver better than those who can't.
If you wanna talk about leadership, again, being very controversial, I don't know if the BBC is around, but they'll certainly disagree with me, but just pull Paul Kagame in charge of the world, everything is sorted. Rwandan president. It's absolutely incredible. He's the voice of the new Africa. He's the guy running a country where women, I think they're about 65% of the public office. Incredibly progressive in terms of made in Africa for Africa. I could go on and on and on. One of the best airlines in the world, quite frankly. And that thought leadership that allowed us to get to the AFCFTA and so on and so forth. If you haven't devoted much time to understanding Paul Kagame, and if you're just listening to the BBC, then I suggest you research a little bit about him. It's an incredible leadership model.
Fantastic. Because we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much. Let's give our audience, our panelists, one last big round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You guys can stay seated whilst I finish up. You guys can stay seated. So thank you so much. So we've had a really good day, I think, today. We've seen some new faces and some old ones that I personally know. And I'd like to thank you for attending. Each one of you has received a questionnaire that I hope you filled out. And to give it up to the table over there with Silva, who has her hands up, or the volunteers can come and collect them. What's going to happen next is you guys will receive our GPI report for 2023. It will discuss what I mentioned today as well as more information. And you'll get that probably through your email beginning of next week, as well as the video content from today, and the pictures will be on a shared database somehow for you guys to share and talk about your experiences. So once again, thank you so much for attending our second annual summit, and I hope to see you again next year. Thank you. Fantastic. So we just finished up the second annual Global Power Index Summit here in London on the 24th of February. It was a fantastic event. We had a great turnout of audience members, 2 fantastic panels as well. The one thing that this summit highlights is the need to understand fundamentals, the fundamentals of why countries are growing and developing as opposed to just focusing on the how. This is done by using first principles analysis, something that Pareto Economics has mastered and has pioneered for world affairs research. And we're more than happy to discuss our research with any of our audience or anyone interested or curious or worried about the future trajectory of countries and the development of power structures in the world today. Thank you very much.